Welcome, dear dreamers. Tonight, beneath the soft glow of the moon, we'll journey into the quiet depths of Shadowwood, where three sisters weave their magic under the stars. As you close your eyes, let the gentle rhythm of your breath and the whispers of the night guide you into a peaceful slumber. Relax and let this enchanting tale carry you into the world of dreams. In the deepest reaches of Shadowwood, where even the sun hesitated to shine, there stood an ancient cottage. It was built not from wood or stone, but from the twisted roots of trees that had long since been forgotten by time. Moss clung to its walls like secrets too dark to speak aloud, and the air around it thrummed with an unspoken power. Few dared to venture near, for it was said that the cottage belonged to the sisters of Shadowwood, three witches who had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. Hespera, the eldest, was a woman of storms. Her hair, streaked with silver, flowed like wind-tossed clouds, and her eyes gleamed with the sharpness of lightning. She spoke little but commanded much, her every glance a promise of tempest to come. Morgana, the middle sister, had the earth itself at her beck and call. Her skin was dark as fertile soil, her voice like the rumble of mountains shifting. She could make the ground tremble with a mere thought, and flowers bloom or wither on her whim. And then there was Celine, the youngest, who danced with moonlight. Her pale skin glowed in the dimmest of nights, and the stars themselves seemed to follow her wherever she went, their light shimmering in her eyes. The villagers in the kingdom beyond Shadowwood spoke of the sisters only in whispers. They were feared, yes, but also respected, for the witches did not bring harm unless provoked. It was known that their power kept the balance between the wild woods and the human world, though no one dared to test the limits of their patience. And yet, each year, as the chill of autumn settled in and the days grew shorter, a strange excitement stirred in the hearts of those who knew of the witches. For with the arrival of Halloween came the sisters' annual competition, a contest of magic unlike any the world had ever seen. On this one night, when the veil between worlds thinned and the very air shimmered with enchantment, the witches would gather beneath the crescent moon to test their strength. Each would summon the deepest magic she could conjure, striving to cast the most powerful spell, to outshine her sisters and claim victory for another year. It was a tradition born of rivalry, but also of sisterhood, a reminder that though they each wielded immense power, they were bound by blood and by the ancient magic that flowed through their veins. This Halloween, however, the air felt different. There was a tension in the wind, a crackle of energy that seemed almost too potent, too wild. Hespera, Morgana, and Celine felt it too, though none spoke of it. They had grown used to the eerie stillness that fell over the forest on Halloween night. But this year, it felt as though the forest itself was watching, waiting for something beyond their control. As the moon rose, casting pale silver light through the branches of the gnarled trees, the witches prepared for their competition. Hespera stood by the window of their cottage, her eyes fixed on the gathering clouds above. Morgana knelt by the hearth, her fingers tracing patterns in the dust that clung to the stone floor, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath her. Celine, perched by the doorway, gazed up at the moon, her lips moving in silent incantation as she whispered to the stars. None of them spoke. They did not need to. The time was near, and each sister knew what was expected of her. Yet, beneath their calm exteriors, a strange unease took root. Their magic, usually so steady, felt restless, as though it too had been waiting for this night. The winds outside began to howl, and Hespera, ever the first to act, stepped into the clearing beyond their home. Morgana followed, her steps slow and deliberate, as though feeling every tremor beneath her feet. Celine, the last to leave, paused at the threshold, casting one final glance at the cottage behind them. Something tugged at her, a whisper on the wind, but she ignored it. There would be time for reflection later. For now, the competition awaited. In the clearing, the air seemed to shimmer with anticipation, the moonlight casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The sisters stood in a circle, each waiting for the other to begin. They had done this many times before, but this time it felt different. This time the magic was heavier, darker, and none of them could shake the feeling that something had already begun to slip beyond their control. As the first spark of magic flickered in the air, a chill ran through the clearing. This Halloween, the Sisters of Shadowwood would learn that some competitions come at too great a cost. The crescent moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest clearing. The witches stood in a circle, their breath visible in the cool night air, waiting for the moment when the hour would turn, when the veil between the worlds would be at its thinnest and their powers at their peak. It was a tradition as old as the magic that coursed through their veins, an unspoken ritual of both rivalry and sisterhood. Hespera, her storm-grey eyes locked on the swirling clouds above, let the first tendrils of magic flow from her fingertips. The winds, already restless, seemed to bow to her will, spinning into life around her like invisible serpents. Her lips moved in a silent incantation, and the skies responded. Dark clouds gathered overhead, rumbling with the promise of thunder. Lightning crackled faintly in the distance, drawn to her like a moth to flame. It was her signature spell, one that had won her many past Halloweens. But this year, Morgana would not be outdone so easily. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble as she summoned her magic. Her eyes, dark as the soil she commanded, glinted with fierce determination. With a wave of her hand, the earth shifted. Trees bent toward her, their roots twisting and groaning as though they were alive. She whispered to the stones beneath the surface, and they responded, rising from the ground like ancient sentinels. The earth itself seemed to breathe, swelling with her power, ready to follow her every command. Selene, standing apart from her sisters, raised her arms to the sky. The moon, once a pale crescent, brightened under her gaze. Her magic was subtler than the tempest of Hespera or the strength of Morgana, but no less potent. The stars above flickered in response to her call, their light dimming as though they bent to her will. A silver glow surrounded her, the air shimmering with the ethereal light of the moon. She closed her eyes, allowing the magic to flow through her, feeling it pulse with a rhythm as old as the stars themselves. For years, the witches had performed this ritual, each striving to outdo the others. It had always been a competition of skill and strength, but there had been no malice, only the silent understanding that their rivalry was a way to push each other to greater heights. The kingdom, though fearful of their power, was left untouched by their games. The magic stayed within the clearing, bound by the unspoken rule that none would harm the land they called home. Yet this year, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a crackle of energy that hummed just beneath the surface of the forest. The moon's light seemed sharper, the shadows deeper. Hespera, Morgana, and Selene felt it, though none would admit it aloud. Pride and tradition held them silent as they each worked to weave their magic, pushing the boundaries of their power. They had felt the call of the night, the pull of the thin veil, and it had ignited something within them, something they did not fully understand. The winds Hespera commanded began to howl, swirling faster and faster, pulling at the trees with a force that made the branches creak and moan. The stones Morgana had summoned began to tremble, vibrating with a low hum that reverberated through the ground. And the stars Selene had dimmed seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm, flickering in and out of sight, like candles caught in a gust of wind. The magic was building, too much, too fast. But the sisters, lost in their competition, did not notice. Their rivalry had blinded them, each focused on her own spell, on proving that she was the most powerful. They did not see the way their magic, once separate, began to intertwine. The winds tangled with the earth, the stars with the storm. And in that moment, the first crack appeared. It was a soundless rupture, a tear in the air itself. The magic, no longer contained by the witch's will, began to unravel, spreading beyond the circle, beyond the clearing, into the forest and beyond. The sisters paused, their eyes wide as they felt the shift. But it was too late. The rift had opened, and with it came something dark. Something neither of them had called, but all of them had unleashed. The forest fell silent for the briefest of moments, as though holding its breath. Then, from the rift, shadows began to spill forth. Creatures formed from the very fabric of darkness, slipping into the world with an unsettling grace. They moved like liquid, their shapes undefined, their presence cold. The witches stood frozen, watching as the shadows spread across the clearing. Their competition had opened a door they could not easily close, and they could feel it. The delicate balance they had kept for years had been shattered. The magic they had unleashed had grown beyond their control. The consequences were only beginning to reveal themselves. The silence that followed the rift's opening was thick, unnatural, as though the very world had paused in anticipation. The three witches, Hespera, Morgana, and Selene, stood rooted in place, their breath caught in their throats, watching as the shadows spilled from the tear like ink bleeding into water. These were not creatures of this world, nor of any other they knew. They were born of the very magic the sisters had unleashed, twisted reflections of their power, but darker, hungrier. The moon, once a steady beacon in the sky, flickered as if caught in the rift's pull. Selene, her connection to the moon as intimate as breath, felt the disruption deep in her chest. She tried to summon the light of the stars, to pull the moon back into its full glow. But the power that usually flowed so easily through her fingers now felt sluggish, trapped. She could do nothing but watch as the shadows swirled, growing bolder, more tangible. "What have we done?" Morgana's voice was a hoarse whisper, her eyes wide with the dawning horror of what had been unleashed. The ground beneath her feet still trembled, but not by her command. It shook in response to the rift, the very earth groaning as if it too was in pain. Hespera's gaze was fixed on the sky, where her storm had unraveled. The clouds she had summoned now hung heavy and inert, as though the life had been drained from them. Her winds, usually wild and obedient, were still. Her power, so fierce and uncontrollable just moments before, had been swallowed by the rift. "We must stop this," Selene murmured, her voice soft but laced with urgency, "before it spreads further." But even as she spoke, the shadows began to move, slowly at first, like creeping vines, but with growing speed and purpose. They spilled over the edges of the clearing, slipping between the trees, moving toward the village that lay beyond the forest. They were searching, hunting for something, though the witches knew not what. The realization hit them all at once. Their competition, the magic that had been meant to impress, had become a weapon of chaos, and its reach was growing with every breath. Hespera, ever the first to act, raised her hands, her fingers curling into fists. She summoned the winds once more, trying to force the magic back into the sky, to sweep the shadows away like debris in a storm. But her power faltered. The wind stirred, weak and disobedient, and the shadows merely parted around them as if mocking her efforts. Morgana stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with determination. If the winds could not banish the darkness, perhaps the earth could contain it. She knelt, placing her palms flat against the trembling ground, and whispered an incantation in the language of the stones. Beneath her hands, the earth responded, rising up in a low wall around the clearing, an attempt to trap the shadows within. But the creatures, born of magic and chaos, slipped through the cracks, seeping into the soil as though they were made of nothing more than smoke. Celine, feeling the moon's light growing weaker, knew they had little time. She reached deep into herself, searching for the ancient magic she had been born with. The magic that tied her to the stars, to the celestial realm beyond the earthly one. She whispered an old spell, one that her mother had taught her in the quiet of the night, when the sky was clear and the stars bright. Her words were soft, almost lost in the howling wind, but they carried a weight, a plea to the heavens themselves. The moon flickered again, brighter this time, and for a moment the shadows seemed to hesitate. Selene felt a spark of hope. Perhaps the light could drive them back, force them into the rift and close the tear. But the moment passed quickly, and the shadows surged once more, as though angered by her defiance. "They're feeding on our magic," Hespera said, her voice low, almost to herself. "The rift, it's drawing power from us. That's why we can't stop it." Morgana stood, dusting her hands off as she turned to face her sisters. "Then we must stop feeding it. We need to work together, not against each other. Our magic is stronger as one." For the first time in years, a flicker of doubt crossed Hespera's face. The rivalry between the sisters had always been fierce, but it had also kept them apart. They had never combined their magic, had never even considered it. Each of them had always believed that their own power was enough. But now, as the shadows moved ever closer to the village, as the rift pulsed with the energy of their fractured spells, there was no other choice. If they did not act soon, the rift would continue to grow, and the kingdom, perhaps the world, would be consumed by the very magic they had once controlled. Celine met her sister's eyes, her face pale but determined. "It's the only way," she whispered. "We must do this together." And so, beneath the flickering moon and the trembling trees, the three sisters, once rivals, now bound by a greater threat, prepared to cast a spell that would test the very limits of their magic. But even as they readied themselves, a question lingered in the air like a shadow. Would it be enough? The night had grown unnaturally still. The rift that hung in the air like a wound in the fabric of the world pulsed, its edges flickering with the faintest traces of the sisters' magic. It seemed to breathe, as though it were alive, pulling in the energy around it, drawing from the very heart of the forest. And the shadows, those twisted, writhing creatures born from the magic, moved ever outward, slithering through the trees with silent purpose. Hespera, Morgana and Selene stood in the clearing, their faces lit by the faint glow of the rift. The cold air pressed in around them, carrying with it the weight of their mistake. The wind no longer howled, the earth no longer trembled. and even the moon's light seemed distant, dimmed by the dark magic that had seeped into the night. What do we do now? Celine's voice was barely a whisper, though it cut through the silence like a blade. She kept her gaze fixed on the rift, the way it shimmered and pulsed with every breath. The stars above seemed to flicker in time with it, as though they too were caught in the pull of its unnatural gravity. Hespera clenched her fists, her storm-grey eyes flashing with a mix of anger and fear. She had always been the strongest, the most powerful. And yet now, in the face of this calamity, she felt powerless. Her winds had failed her, her control over the skies lost to the ravenous hunger of the rift. It gnawed at her pride, but there was no denying the truth. "We have to close it," she said, her voice low and sharp, "before it consumes everything." Morgana, ever the most pragmatic of the sisters, moved toward the rift, her brow furrowed in thought. Her connection to the earth hummed faintly beneath her feet, but even the soil, once so obedient to her command, seemed distant now, as though the land itself recoiled from the magic that had been unleashed. She could feel the energy of the rift pulling at her, its dark tendrils reaching for her power, hungering for it. She stopped just before the edge of the tier, her hands hovering in the air before her. "It's feeding off us," she murmured, echoing Hespera's earlier realization. "Every spell we cast makes it stronger. But if we could find a way to weaken it, to sever its connection to our magic, maybe we can close it. But how?" Celine's voice trembled slightly, though she masked it with a determined look. She had always been the quietest of the sisters, her power subtle, drawn from the stars and the moon. But tonight, even the celestial bodies felt distant, as though they too had turned their backs on her. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the creeping dread that had settled deep in her bones. Morgana's eyes narrowed. "We need something ancient, something stronger than the magic we've been using. A spell that binds, that weaves our powers together. One spell, cast as one." Hespera scoffed, her usual confidence returning for a moment. "And where exactly do you propose we find such a spell, Morgana? In one of our forgotten tomes?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, but beneath it lay a kernel of fear, a fear that perhaps this time they were truly out of their depth. Morgana, however, was undeterred. "Not forgotten, Hespera, remembered. There's an old spell, one our mother spoke of, though she never taught it to us. It binds magic together, stronger than any one of us alone. It could work." Celine's heart skipped a beat. The spell Morgana spoke of was one she had heard only in whispers, passed down through generations of witches. It was said to be dangerous, requiring not just power but trust. A complete merging of magic, without competition or pride. A binding of their very essences. The thought unsettled her. Hespera crossed her arms, her stormy gaze flicking between her sisters. And if it doesn't work, what then? We make the rift stronger and doom ourselves in the process. Morgana turned to face her, her voice steady and unyielding. If we do nothing, the rift will spread. You know that as well as I do. The kingdom, the entire world, will fall into darkness. We have no choice. For a long moment, the silence stretched between them. The rift continued to pulse, the shadows creeping ever closer to the village beyond the trees. The weight of their decision pressed down on them like a tangible force. Celine closed her eyes, feeling the faint tug of the moon's light, distant but steady, a reminder of the power that still lived within her. "I'll do it," she said quietly, opening her eyes to meet her sister's gazes. "If we cast the spell together, it might work." Hespera's jaw tightened, her pride warring with the knowledge that Morgana was right. Finally, with a slow nod, she relented. "Fine, but this better not be another mistake." Morgana gave a grim smile. "We have to trust each other. That's the only way." And so, the sisters of Shadowwood prepared to cast the spell that could either save their world or doom it. But in the stillness of the night, as the rift pulsed and the shadows crept ever closer, none of them could shake the feeling that their greatest challenge was yet to come. The moon, once a steady sentinel in the sky, flickered weakly above as the sisters of Shadowwood prepared to enact their most dangerous spell. A silence, thick as fog, pressed down upon the clearing, broken only by the faint whisper of the rift's pulse and the soft, eerie rustle of the shadows weaving through the trees. The air felt heavy with something ancient, something far older than the sisters themselves, as though the forest had drawn its breath and was waiting for their next move. Hespera, Morgana, and Celine stood in a tight circle, their faces pale in the dim light. The magic that crackled between them felt different now, tense, unwilling, almost as though it too sensed the risk of what they were about to do. But there was no turning back, not with the rift growing larger by the moment, not with the creatures it had unleashed already creeping toward the unsuspecting village. "We don't have much time," Morgana murmured, her eyes flicking toward the distant glow of the village lights. Even from here, she could sense the fear beginning to ripple through the land. The villagers knew nothing of the dark magic that now threatened to devour their world, but soon they would feel its cold fingers wrapping around their lives. Celine, her face pale and drawn, raised her gaze to the sky. The stars were dim, barely visible through the haze of magic that clouded the air. She felt the weight of the moon, usually her closest ally, hanging distant and cold above her. The pull of its power was still there, faint and muted, but something about it had changed. The rift had severed her connection to the celestial, and now she was left with only fragments of her former strength. "We need to begin," she whispered, her voice laced with urgency. Hespera nodded, though her expression remained hard, unreadable. She was a force of storms, used to bending the very elements to her will. And yet now she felt as though she was walking a tightrope over a chasm she could not see. Her pride, so often her shield, now weighed heavily on her. She knew this spell would require more than just power. It would require trust. And trust was something that had long been fractured between the three of them. Morgana took a deep breath and began to speak the words of the ancient spell, her voice low and steady. The incantation was older than time itself, woven from the threads of a magic that bound all things. It was a spell meant to unify, to merge the strengths of the witches into one unbreakable force. But it was also dangerous. If they faltered, if even one of them held back, the spell could turn on them, magnifying the very rift they sought to close. As Morgana's voice filled the clearing, Selene and Hespera joined in, their voices blending into a single resonant hum. The air around them shimmered, and for a moment, the shadows that had slithered from the rift seemed to hesitate, as if sensing the change. The power of the spell grew, wrapping around the sisters like an invisible thread, binding their magic together. It was a strange, unsettling sensation, feeling their individual strengths blur into something shared, something vast and unknowable. The rift shuddered, its pulsing rhythm faltering. The shadows recoiled, retreating slightly into the darkness, as though sensing the threat of the combined magic. For the first time since the disaster began, the sisters felt a spark of hope. The spell was working, or so it seemed. But then, a ripple of unease passed through them. Something was wrong. Hespera's storm magic, wild and fierce, surged against the binding spell, resisting the unity. The winds she had summoned earlier stirred again, not by her command, but by something deeper, something primal. Morgana's connection to the earth trembled, the stones beneath her feet vibrating as if struggling to hold themselves in place. And Selene, her moonlit power already weakened, felt her control slipping as the stars above flickered out of sync with her words. Without warning, the rift pulsed violently, and the shadows surged forward once more, drawn by the instability in their magic. The sisters' spell, meant to bind, was unraveling before their eyes. "Stop!" Hespera's voice rang out, sharp and desperate, but it was too late. The rift, sensing their faltering unity, fed off the chaos, expanding with a sickening lurch. The shadows, no longer held at bay, flooded the clearing, their forms twisting and coiling like dark serpents, their movements erratic and hungry. The ground beneath Morgana's feet split open, cracks spider-webbing out from the center of the clearing.
The very earth she had once controlled now rebelled against her, its power drawn into the rift's insatiable hunger. Selene's light flickered, then dimmed entirely, leaving only the faintest trace of moonlight to illuminate the scene. And Hespera, her storms raging out of her control, felt the winds whip around her, no longer heeding her command. The sisters were losing. "We must try again," Celine whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't let it win." But even as she spoke, the rift widened further, the shadows pouring out like a curse, darkening the night, and with it, the sisters' hope. Their rivalry had unleashed a power greater than they had ever imagined, and now they faced the consequences of their own undoing. The curse had been unleashed, and it would not be easily undone. The forest had changed. Where once it whispered and hummed with the life of magic, now it lay silent, smothered by an unnatural darkness that seemed to seep from the very ground. The rift, now a gaping wound in the night sky, pulsed with a malevolent energy, casting long, jagged shadows across the clearing. The creatures it had birthed, those twisted, formless shades, had spread beyond the reach of the witch's control. They slithered between the trees, their presence felt more than seen, a cold that clung to the air, devouring all light and warmth. Hespera, Morgana, and Celine stood in the clearing, their magic unraveling around them like frayed thread. The spell they had cast, the one meant to bind their powers and heal the rift, had failed. Worse, it had fed the very chaos they sought to contain. Now, their magic was slipping through their fingers, wild and unyielding, as if it no longer belonged to them. The wind howled, though not at Hespera's command. She stood rigid, her silver-streaked hair whipping around her face, her storm-gray eyes wide with disbelief. The winds she had once bent to her will now roared with a life of their own, swirling violently around the clearing, pulling at the trees and scattering leaves like lost whispers. She could feel it. Her magic, once so powerful and untamed, had become part of the rift's hunger, a force beyond her control. For the first time in her life, Hespera was afraid. Morgana, always the one grounded in the strength of the earth, knelt beside a deep crack that had splintered the forest floor. Her fingers traced the jagged edge, feeling the tremors beneath the surface. The earth had turned against her. The very stones she had called upon to shield them now quaked with the same dark energy that bled from the rift. She whispered to the ground, begging it to calm, but it no longer heeded her voice. There was a force at play here that even she could not tame. And Celine, pale, luminous Celine, stood with her gaze fixed on the sky. The stars, her constant companions, had dimmed, their light swallowed by the rift's shadow. The moon, usually so bright and full of secrets, hung distant and cold, as though it had turned its face away from her. She reached out with her magic, searching for the connection she had always felt with the heavens, but there was nothing. The celestial realm had gone silent, leaving her in the dark. The village. Celine's voice trembled as she spoke, her eyes finally dropping from the sky to meet her sister's. We have to stop this before it reaches them. Hespera's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists. She had always been the strongest, the one who led, But now, she felt as if she were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into a void she could not control. "How?" she spat, frustration lacing her words. "Our magic has failed us. The rift is feeding on everything we do." Morgana stood slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands, her expression grim. "It's not just feeding on our magic," she said softly, her dark eyes scanning the clearing. "It's feeding on us, on our fear, our doubts. The more we struggle, the stronger it becomes." Celine's heart sank at her sister's words. She had felt it too, the way the rift seemed to grow with every misstep, every moment of uncertainty. Their rivalry, their pride, had been the rift's true source of power, and now the consequences of their fractured bond were unfolding before their eyes. "We can't keep fighting it," Celine whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "Not like this. We're giving it what it wants." Hespera's eyes flashed with anger. "So what? We do nothing? Let it consume us?"
"No," Celine said, her gaze steady, though her hands trembled at her sides. "We don't fight it. We surrender to it." Morgana's eyes narrowed, her brow furrowing. "What are you saying, Celine?" "I'm saying we need to stop resisting," Celine replied, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "The rift is feeding on our division, on the chaos between us. If we stop struggling, if we let go of our pride, our fear, it might stop feeding." Hespera opened her mouth to protest, but something in Celine's eyes made her pause. For years, their rivalry had been fierce, unyielding, a competition for power, for control. But now, as the darkness threatened to consume everything they held dear, it was clear that their old ways would no longer serve them. Morgana was the first to speak, her voice low and thoughtful. "It's risky," she said slowly. "But if we don't try, the rift will only keep growing." Celine nodded. "We cast the spell again, not to control, not to win, but to unify, to let go." For a moment, silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the distant roar of the wind and the pulsing hum of the rift. Then Hespera nodded, her face hard with determination. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "But this time, we do it together." And so, as the shadows closed in around them, and the rift pulsed hungrily in the night sky, the three sisters of Shadowwood prepared to cast the most dangerous spell of all, a spell not of power, but of surrender. The clearing was bathed in an unnatural darkness, broken only by the faint, pulsing light of the rift. The shadows that had escaped its depths loomed at the edges of the forest, formless and hungry, waiting for the sisters to falter. But this time, there was no panic in the air, no frantic casting of spells. Instead, a stillness had settled over the witches, as if the weight of the moment had drawn all movement from the world. Hespera, Morgana, and Celine stood in the center of the clearing, their forms outlined by the dim, flickering light of the rift. The The wind had died. The earth beneath their feet had gone silent, and even the distant cries of the creatures from the rift had fallen away. It was as though the very night itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. Morgana stepped forward, her hands outstretched, palms open toward her sisters. "We cannot close the rift with power alone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We need the spell, the one our mother spoke of, the one that binds magic through unity, not force." Hespera narrowed her eyes. The mention of their mother, the long-dead witch who had once commanded more power than all three of them combined, stirred something deep within her. Memories, half forgotten, drifted to the surface of her mind. She could hear her mother's voice, soft and distant, speaking of spells too dangerous to cast, of magic that required more than strength. "You mean that spell?" Hespera's voice was tight, her usual confidence wavering. "The one she warned us about. The one she said could destroy us if we weren't united," Celine finished softly, stepping closer to her sisters. Her silver eyes gleamed in the dim light, her pale face serene despite the chaos around them. "Yes, that spell." The silence between them stretched thin, heavy with the weight of the choice before them. The spell their mother had once spoken of was more than just a binding of magic. It required them to trust one another completely, to give up control of their individual powers and merge them into something greater. It was a spell of surrender, not just of pride, but of identity. And if they failed, the consequences could be devastating. Hespera glanced at the rift, its dark energy pulsing like a heartbeat in the night. The shadows still hovered at the edges of the clearing, restless but waiting. The village was close now, too close. If they did nothing, the darkness would spread, and all they had once protected would fall. "We don't have a choice," she said, her voice low. "If this is the only way, we'll do it. But we need the grimoire." Morgana nodded, her eyes dark and serious. "It's in the old tower. Mother left it there before she died. I'll get it." Without another word, Morgana turned and disappeared into the shadows at the edge of the forest, her steps quick and sure. The tower, long abandoned and hidden deep within Shadowwood, had once been their mother's sanctuary, a place where the most powerful magic was kept, far from the hands of anyone who might misuse it. It was where the sisters had first learned their craft, where they had grown into the witches they were now. Hespera and Selene waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the rift as it pulsed in the darkness, its rhythm slow and ominous. The creatures that had emerged from it seemed to watch them, though they made no move to approach. Perhaps they too were waiting for something the sisters did not yet understand. When Morgana returned, the ancient grimoire cradled in her arms, the air in the clearing seemed to shift. The book, bound in cracked leather and worn with age, thrummed with a deep, quiet power. It was heavier than it looked, as though the very weight of the knowledge it contained pressed down on the world around it. Morgana's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the book, her eyes scanning the faded pages until she found the spell they needed. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The spell of unity. It requires all three of us to cast it, and we can't hesitate. We must let go of everything or it won't work." Hespera's jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Let's begin." Selene, her pale face lit by the faint glow of the rift, stepped forward, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "We do this together," she said softly. "Not as rivals, as sisters." They formed a circle, their hands clasped together, the grimoire open in the center. The air around them grew still once more, the shadows at the edges of the clearing retreating as if sensing the power that was about to be unleashed. Morgana began to speak the words of the spell, her voice low and steady, each syllable vibrating with ancient magic. Hespera followed, her voice stronger, more sure than before. And finally, Selene added her voice, her words weaving through the spell like a thread of moonlight. Together, their magic began to rise, not in competition, but in perfect harmony. The rift shuddered, its pulse growing weaker, the dark energy it had fed on now draining away. The shadows at the edges of the forest began to retreat, dissolving into the night as the sisters' magic grew stronger, filling the clearing with a light that seemed to come from within them. And for the first time in years, the witches of Shadowwood stood united, no longer bound by rivalry, but by the strength of their bond. The air was thick with the weight of the spell. As Hespera, Morgana, and Selene stood in the circle, their hands clasped tightly, the ancient words of the spell of unity hung in the air like a fragile thread. Their voices, once so distinct, now blended into one resonant hum, a sound that seemed to vibrate with the very fabric of the night. The grimoire lay open between them, its pages fluttering with an invisible wind, as if the book itself were alive, guiding their magic. Morgana's voice led the incantation, strong and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. Hespera's magic, fierce and untamed, surged through her words, sending ripples through the winds above. And Selene, her connection to the stars still flickering faintly, wove the light of the moon through their spell, her voice soft but unwavering. The spell grew, wrapping around them like invisible threads of power, binding their magic together. The air shimmered with energy, and for the first time since the rift had opened, the balance between them felt right. There was no more resistance, no more struggle. They were no longer three separate witches, each vying for dominance. They were one. The rift, which had been pulsing with a dark and hungry energy, began to slow. Its jagged edges flickered, the shadows that had spilled from it retreating into the darkness. The creatures that had roamed the forest, born from the witch's fractured magic, now slithered back into the rift, as though drawn by the spell's pull. The air was growing colder, but the chaos that had once reigned was starting to calm. Hespera's eyes flicked to the rift as its dark light dimmed. "It's working," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the hum of their magic. For the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope. The winds, once wild and unyielding, now moved in harmony with her, swirling gently around the clearing. Morgana's brow furrowed in concentration as the earth beneath them stilled. The tremors that had shaken the ground were now faint, a distant memory of the chaos they had unleashed. She could feel the magic in her blood, the power of the earth flowing through her, but it was no longer wild. It was controlled, guided by the unity of their spell. But Selene felt something else. As the rift began to close, she sensed a resistance, something dark and ancient stirring at its core. The light of the moon, usually her greatest ally, seemed dimmer, distant. The connection she had once felt with the stars flickered weakly, like a candle about to go out. She could feel the rift pulling at her magic, tugging at the fragile threads of the spell they had woven together. "There's something wrong," Selene whispered, her voice tense. She tightened her grip on her sister's hands, her eyes fixed on the rift. "It's not letting go." Morgana's eyes snapped open, her voice faltering for a moment as the ground beneath her shifted. "What do you mean?" "It's fighting us," Selene said, her voice trembling with the strain of holding the spell together. "There's something inside it, something older, something that doesn't want to be sealed." Hespera's gaze darkened as she looked toward the rift. The shadows that had once poured from it were thinning, but they had not disappeared. The rift itself, though smaller, still pulsed with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It was as if the darkness within it was alive, resisting their efforts to close it. "We need more power," Morgana said, her voice tight with urgency. "If we can't close it, the rift will reopen, and everything we've done will be for nothing." But there was no more power to give. The sisters had poured everything they had into the spell, every ounce of their magic woven into the threads of unity. And yet, it wasn't enough. Selene's gaze flicked upward, toward the dimming stars. Her connection to the celestial realm had been weakening ever since the rift had opened. But now, in this moment of desperation, she felt something stir deep within her. A memory, distant and half forgotten, of their mother's teachings. The lessons she had whispered to Selene beneath the light of the moon. "Trust the stars," their mother had said. "They will always guide you." Selene took a deep breath, her grip tightening on her sister's hands. "We're not alone," she whispered. "The stars, there's still light in them. We need to reach for it, together." Hespera and Morgana exchanged a glance, but neither hesitated. They knew Selene's connection to the stars was deeper than their own magic, and if there was any chance of sealing the rift, they had to trust her. With a deep breath, Celine closed her eyes and reached out with her magic, searching for the faintest glimmer of starlight. And there, in the vast darkness, she found it. A single thread of light, distant but unwavering. She pulled at it, gently at first, then with more force, drawing the light down toward them. The stars responded, their light spilling into the clearing like silver rain, wrapping around the witches, strengthening their spell. The rift, once pulsing with dark energy, flickered, its edges wavering. And slowly, ever so slowly, it began to shrink. The sisters' magic, now woven with the light of the stars, surged through the clearing, pushing the shadows back into the rift. The darkness fought against them, resisting with a force that shook the ground beneath their feet. But the light held firm. And with a final trembling pulse, the rift sealed. The night fell silent. The witches stood in the clearing, their hands still clasped, the air around them shimmering with the faint remnants of magic. The rift was gone, and with it, the shadows that had once threatened to consume the world. But as the stars faded back into the night sky, Celine couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. Something dark and restless, still lurking just beneath the surface of the world they had saved. The night had returned to its natural stillness, but something hung in the air, an echo of the magic that had just unfolded, a quiet hum that seemed to vibrate in the very fabric of the forest. The rift was gone, its darkness sealed away by the unity of the three witches. Yet the clearing, once wild with chaotic energy, was now eerily calm. The wind no longer howled, the earth no longer trembled, and the moon, pale and distant, watched over the scene like a silent sentinel. Hespera, Morgana and Celine stood in a circle, their hands still clasped, though the urgency of the moment had passed. For a long time, none of them spoke. The weight of what had just transpired lingered between them, as heavy and as thick as the shadows that had once surrounded them. The stars above twinkled faintly, as though the heavens had returned to their natural order. But deep in her heart, Celine knew that something had changed, something beyond the mere closing of the rift. The ancient power they had summoned, the unity they had forged, had done more than seal the tear in the fabric of their world. It had left a mark, a scar in the unseen currents of magic that flowed through the forest. "It's over," Hespera finally said, her voice a quiet murmur that barely disturbed the stillness of the night. Her silver-streaked hair, once wild from the storm, now hung limp around her face, and her eyes, those storm-grey eyes that so often flashed with power, were weary. The winds had stilled, no longer bending to her command. She had given everything to the spell, and it had left her feeling hollow, as though a part of her had been carried away with the rift's closing. Morgana nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the ground beneath her feet. The earth, once so vibrant beneath her touch, now felt distant, as though the pulse of life that had always responded to her magic had been quieted. She knelt, pressing her hand against the soil, feeling only the faintest hum of energy beneath the surface. "For now," she said softly, "but there is a cost." Celine's eyes drifted upward, to the sky where the stars flickered faintly. She could still feel the remnants of the light she had called down, the celestial magic that had intertwined with their own to seal the rift. It had been powerful, far more powerful than anything she had ever wielded. And yet, in the wake of that power, she felt an unsettling emptiness, as though the stars themselves had withdrawn from her. The connection she had once felt with the moon, with the stars, was now a distant echo. She feared it might never fully return. "But we stopped it," Celine said, her voice quieter than a whisper. "The rift is gone. The village is safe." Hespera's gaze flickered to the distant glow of the village, the faint lights of the cottages just visible through the trees. She nodded slowly. "Yes, we stopped it, but the magic, it's changed. We've changed." Morgana stood, her dark eyes meeting Hespera's. "The unity we forged, the spell, it was more than just magic. It bound us in a way we've never been bound before. We gave up our rivalry, our pride, but that doesn't come without consequences." Celine could feel the truth of her sister's words. The spell of unity had required more than just the merging of their powers. It had demanded they surrender their individual wills, their control, and for the briefest of moments, they had become something greater than themselves. But in that surrender, they had lost something too, an independence, a piece of themselves that would never be fully recovered. "We may never be the same," Hespera said, her voice heavy with the weight of understanding. "But perhaps that's what needed to happen. Our magic, our rivalry, it was tearing us apart. It nearly destroyed everything." For a long moment, the sisters stood in silence, the truth of their words sinking in. They had spent years competing, each trying to prove her magic was the strongest, the most powerful. And in doing so, they had nearly unleashed a darkness that would have consumed the world. But now, after the spell of unity, they were no longer the same witches who had once fought for dominance. They were bound by something deeper, something unbreakable. Celine looked up at the stars again, their faint light shimmering in the dark sky. "Perhaps this is how it was always meant to be," she whispered. "Not separate, but together, a balance."